Hello, I'm Chris Payne. I'm from Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I'm here to talk about the injustices committed upon my nephew, Lincoln Keith. Lincoln Keith was convicted in approximately 1990 for capital murder of Mrs. Juanita Green. The sad thing about it is it was the whole court trial was unjust. Nothing was handled according to the Constitution of the United States, which should represent all of us, the Constitution. The Lincoln Keith supposedly went into a room with another man and shot Mrs. Green from the foot of the bed with a pump 22. This young man, they arrested him, and this young man for an hour sat there and 30 pages of testimony said Lincoln Keith didn't do it. Lincoln Keith didn't do it. Finally, they said, "You're a witness. Witnesses aren't convicted. Didn't Lincoln Keith do it?" So they turned the camera off. 20 minutes later, they come back and the written testimony began again. And this Josh Humphreys this co-defendant started stating that Lincoln Keith, how he murdered Mrs. Green. Then, when it came time for the court and for him to take the stand, he refused to take the stand and testify against Lincoln Keith. But they allowed in his written testimony against Lincoln Keith, 70 pages. According to the Sixth Amendment, you have a right to confront and to cross-examine adverse witnesses. When a written testimony is allowed, you can't cross-examine that. You can't break down the testimony. And Lincoln Keith couldn't cross-examine a written testimony that was read out loud in the courtroom to break down what was being said. Also, during going to the Constitution, sticking to the Constitution, you also have a right to an impartial jury. When they search for a jury, they ask everybody, "Do you know anybody that has to do with this case?" And everybody said, "No, we don't know anybody that has to do with this case." So they picked their 12 jury members. Well, in the end, the jury, according to juror member Carl Bizzle, and he wrote an affidavit stating so, the jury was leaning toward acquittal for Lincoln Keith. They were talking about acquittal, or at least not capital murder, but maybe simply murder. Juror member Ford stood up and he said, "I know Snow Robinson." And Snow Robinson was the key witness against Lincoln Keith in the trial. And he said, "I know Snow Robinson's family, and they're good people. And Snow Robinson would not lie." So juror member Ford wasn't supposed to know the key witness. And Carl Bizzle, the other jury member, in his affidavit said, then the jury began to be swayed by what Ford was saying about this witness's testimony, Snow Robinson, against Lincoln Keith. And then they moved it on to capital murder, and Lincoln Keith received 40 years in prison without parole. So it was jury misconduct. Juror member Ford didn't say, "I know this person, Snow Robertson, and his family." He'd known him for years. Another thing that happened in the courtroom, Lincoln Keith, when they arrested him, Snow Robinson pulled him out of bed at 8 o'clock in the morning, threw him in a police car, took him down to the police station, and they interrogated him all day long till 8 o'clock at night. Snow Robinson, the head detective, walked into the room and said, "You know what, I have a confession from this boy. He gave it to me at 8 o'clock this morning at the time I arrested him." In the courtroom, they asked Snow Robinson, if he gave you a confession at the time of arrest, when you rode the 30 minutes in the police car down to the courthouse, to the jailhouse, police station, did you tell Texas Ranger that was with you that he had given you a confession that he had murdered this woman? He said, "No, I didn't tell him." He said, "Well, what would be the normal procedure?" He said, "Don't you keep a cassette player? And you'd get him to say it again on the cassette." "Yes, that would be." "Did you do that?" He said, "No." They then asked him, well, what about a notebook? Would you write it? Yes, I would normally write. Did you? He said, no, I didn't. They said, why did you wait 12 hours before you told anybody in here that he had given you a confession that very morning? He said, I don't know why. Well, because of Snow Robinson was known for these backseat confessions already in his career, Judge Gibson said, I'm not going to allow this in the courtroom. And they argued about it for a long time, or whether or not they were going to allow this so-called confession into the courtroom. Well, they said, well, we'll discuss that at the time during the trial. Well, at that time, as they were coming up to that point in the trial, Snow Robinson, the detective that arrested Lincoln, was on the stand, and he just blurted out that, well, when I arrested Lincoln, he said, I didn't kill that old lady for nothing. They paid me $400 to kill her. And they were supposed to stop the trial and talk about it if that was going to be let in. So at that point, Lincoln's attorneys asked for a mistrial. And the mistrial, they sent the jurors out of the room, discussed it, and then they decided to go ahead and let it in. Well, it had to be let it in because Snow Robinson had already blurted it out in front of the jury at this time. So they went on with the trial. But not only that, come to find out that Snow Robinson, the lead witness against Lincoln Keith and detective leading up the case, that was supposed to be trying to search for the truth for both the district attorney and for Mrs. Green, was having an affair with the district attorney that was, and he married her right after the trial. They went off to Ruidoso, New Mexico and got married. That's Snow Robinson and Mrs. Diedrich, I believe was her name. Then the sad thing about it is those were court-appointed attorneys. Then we hired attorneys with my money. I had to help my mother and my sister. And the attorneys, I gave the first one $20,000, and he said, wait. And I said, well, the writ of habeas corpus for the federal court has to be filed within 1 year. That's all we have. He said, no, we can get around that. Don't worry about that. And he said, we're waiting for a case in Virginia versus Lilly to come down before we file this writ because it'll get Lincoln a new trial. So we followed his direction and we waited. The case did come down in the Supreme Court of Lilly versus Virginia, and it was for Lilly against the state of Virginia in his conviction. And the exact same thing had happened. A written testimony had been allowed into the courtroom from a adverse witness, and Lilly had not got a chance to cross-examine. His lawyers had to cross-examine that individual to break down that testimony because it was a written testimony against him. He had a right to face his accuser. He didn't get that chance, and neither did Lincoln Keith. So the Supreme Court ruled on that decision, and Mr. Lilly got a new trial. And that's all we're asking for is a new trial. However, they come back when we finally did get before the state, Judge Gibson again, and what they ended up saying is the Lilly Virginia case is not retroactive. It won't go back. Well, the sad thing about that is the Constitution, it was written 1776, whenever it was written, I don't know. But it doesn't have to go back. Lincoln's so-called crime happened way after the Constitution. If it applied to Lilly, it applies to Lincoln Keith. And he has a right to break down the testimony against him. You can't do it if it's a written testimony read out loud in the courtroom. There were many other things that happened in the courtroom as well. Then the woman was 70 years old when she was shot, and she would do misconduct against Melanie Green, her granddaughter. She'd do horrible things to her. She was raising her. She was only 15 years old. She would put bloody tampons in her peanut butter and jelly sandwich and send her granddaughter to school. She had bought a funeral plot for her granddaughter and herself and said she was going to kill them both the day of the murder. Many things happened to this poor granddaughter, and poor Mrs. Green ended up dead as well from supposedly my nephew Lincoln Keith. The interesting thing about it, though, is Lincoln supposedly shot her with a pump 22 rifle, and in the dark, across a big bedroom, he hits her in the head 3 times with the size of a 50-cent piece. A pump 22 moves when you shoot it. It's in the dark. The kids testified that Lincoln was barking like a dog and seeing spiders on the ceilings because he was on so much drugs. Another thing, Mrs. Green was probably 70. They found her in the bed, completely naked, no clothes on at all. Most older women don't sleep in the nude like that. She also was found in the bed wearing all of her jewelry, which she wore a lot of jewelry. Most women take their jewelry off before they go to bed. She had her makeup on completely. Most women wash their makeup off. The covers were tucked around her as if she had tucked herself in. And the kids say that Lincoln shot her and then they left the house. One more interesting thing is there was no fingerprints in the house, so someone had obviously wiped the house clean. Mrs. Green had gun residues on her hands. They described that away by saying that was probably from a beer can that she had drank earlier that night. So the bad thing is the prosecution went first. Lincoln's court-appointed attorneys chose not to put on a defense and didn't use any of these things for Lincoln Keith. There was no defense put on for him, although he wanted a defense. And I know that everybody kind of says that same thing when no defense is used. But Lincoln was only 18. He just turned 18 by 1 month. He was a very young man. The family was distraught, completely messed up. Their son was looking at the death penalty. So there were many injustices done in this situation. You would think you would get a just trial, that such laws, and if such laws were broken, then you'd get a new trial, because the Constitution applies to all of us. The sad thing is in the end, we waited for the Virginia Lilly case to come down to use, and it was in our favor. But now the state says it doesn't matter. Judge Gibson says it doesn't matter. No new trial. That's the state judge. So we decided to go through the federal courts to try to get Lincoln a new trial on mainly the breaking down of his Constitution and jury misconduct. And we even have the affidavits from Carl Bizzle stating so. However, we're told that you have 1 year, and it doesn't matter. We have the writing in here where they said this in the courtroom. If you're blind, if you're deaf, if you're retarded, if you don't get this done in 1 year, your writ of habeas corpus, I believe is what it's called, in the federal system, you don't get another chance. Time's out. And although the attorneys told us after spending $100,000 they could still get it into federal, we never could get it into federal. And so today, 18 years later, Lincoln still sits in prison, and all we want is a new trial. We want a defense for Lincoln Keith. We want him to have a right to face his accuser. We want him to have a fair jury without jury misconduct. People on the jury who had known for years the family. We want the detective to not be having an affair with the district attorney that is trying our nephew. These things are sad, and they happen to everybody across America. We don't really know where to go from here. We're just doing our best as a family. We're a normal family. We've never had a crime in our family in our life. We'd try to get Lincoln Keith to go hunting with us as a young man to shoot jackrabbits on the ranch, and he refused to. He wasn't that kind of individual. He'd only known these kids, 5 or 6 kids, for 2 weeks, and they'd known each other their whole lives. The interesting thing is the young woman that supposedly hired Lincoln Keith that made it capital murder, Melanie Green, her trial took place 6 months later outside of Odessa, Texas, where the crime was committed in Sweetwater, Texas. And she was acquitted of all crimes. She didn't do anything. Yet Lincoln Keith is serving 40 years because they supposedly paid him $400 to put a hit on her grandmother. Yet she's innocent. The one who was the payee was totally innocent. How can Lincoln be guilty of capital murder, accepting money to murder someone, when the person who supposedly paid him was proven innocent? There's all these things that went down in that trial, and I'm trying to keep things short, but it's an injustice. There is no justice. The Bible says that. We have seen it in our own family. I would have never believed it could happen in America, and these things did happen. There's articles, newspaper articles, and we have copies of these newspaper articles. Snow Robinson was fired from the Ector County Police Department after that, and he moved away to Dallas because Judge Gibson said he'd never have him in his courtroom again and there's whole newspapers about it, talking about these backseat confessions like he supposedly got from Lincoln Keith and others. Folks, I'm Chris Payne. If there's some way I could talk about this more in the future, I'll be glad to. My family will be glad to. And we appreciate everything being done here with this work. Thank you.